this point in time. Now, the capitalist class are not just observing these events on a world scale. They're not just going to art galleries or playing bridge or investing in football teams. They're preparing and watching events to see what's the best way to combat the rise of left-wing movements and mass uprisings. The far right at the moment is gaining a foothold in quite a few countries. Now, the capitalists their preferred option would be bourgeois democracy, where workers can vote every 4 or 5 years. They create the illusion of stability, the illusion of involvement, and the illusion of having a say in the way society is run. Workers can't vote, of course, on the rents they pay or the wages they get, but every 5 years they traipse to the polling booths, and that form of bourgeois democracy suits the capitalist class. But when it no longer suits them, they then turn to other forms of rule, like military rule, police state, theocracy, like in Saudi Arabia, for example, where they have an absolute monarchy, but also simultaneously a theocracy. And then occasionally then outright fascism, such as happened in Europe in the 1930s. So the different forms of rule, when we look at them, it's not an academic question, because different tactics and strategy are required by the working class movement in resisting these forms of undemocratic rule, stretching from fascism, military police state, Bonapartism, theocracy, and so on. So we need to study them not from an academic perspective, but from the point of view of finding out what's the best strategy and tactics to develop to combat them. Now, the far right are limbering up. In some countries, they're actually in power. In Poland, in Hungary, in India, in Brazil, in Austria, not at the moment, but recently in the last government, the Freedom Party were in government. Now they're the third largest party in Austria. In terms of Ireland, I'll just explain what's happening over here at the moment. We formed a group called Lekele. Lekele is an Irish word for together, and it's from a proverb, Inart Lekor Lekele. There's nothing like unity when you want to achieve victory. So that group, the Dublin Council of Trade Unions was to the forefront in forming that group, and it brings together trade unions, anti-racist groups, various organizations that are fighting against the far right, some leading personalities, poets, broadcasters, and so on. And we've organized a series of marches, demonstrations, online seminars as a way of preparing and taking part in combating these right-wing forces. We had quite a big meeting recently on the north side of Dublin with representative speakers from quite a range of groups, from the Irish Women's Council, anti-racist groups, trade union groups, and so on. I should also mention that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, which is the Irish TUC, recently formed a group with the intention, with the aim of combating the rise of far-right ideas in the trade union movement. The slogan they use is anti-mask is anti-worker. And they've formed a few kind of educational groups and so on. So that's a significant advance for us. The right-wing groups in Ireland wouldn't be very well known, but they come under the banner of extreme nationalism. They all go around waving Irish flags and shouting about Irish homes for Irish people and things of that nature. So they take part in various protests about housing, but the aim, of course, is far different. It's divisive. Now, constant vigilance is required. This is a global phenomenon. The Fidesz party in Hungary has moved against media, sacked journalists. They have put out propaganda about George Soros, anti-Jewish propaganda, anti-Muslim propaganda, saying that Soros is organizing a conspiracy to replace Christian Hungary with a Muslim population. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party is authoritarian. They've sacked thousands of civil servants and replaced them with party hacks. They've sacked army generals and leaders of business. They've violated the constitution and recently passed a decree giving extreme powers to the president. They are also, of course, under some censor from the European Union at the present time. In India, Narendra Modi using Hindu nationalist propaganda and the BJP party to maintain his rule. It's worth noting as well that the founders of the BJP admired Hitler, and that there's a quasi-fascist group linked to that organization, the RSS, the National Voluntary Corps. In the Philippines, we have a regime which has killed hundreds, if not thousands, of people in this war against drugs. In Brazil, Bolsonaro, who has been responsible directly and personally for the deaths of thousands of Brazilians from COVID, recently addressed a rally back in September the 7th, and he said the following: "Only God can remove me from power." So you can see the kind of people we're dealing with here. In Italy, there's quite a strong right-wing movement developing now. There's a group called the Brothers of Italy, which incidentally is led by a sister called Giorgia Meloni. But nonetheless, that group now has got more support than Salvini's Northern League. It's replaced or largely supplanted what was a five-star movement, so much so that Silvio Berlusconi is now seen as a moderate. Yet even with all of that, in the recent elections, by the way, that group has also attacked trade union headquarters in Italy, but in regions, they actually suffered a bit of a setback. So it's not all negative. It is possible to fight these people. Czech Republic, similarly, their leader, right-wing leader, has recently been implicated in the Pandora scandals about money, 22 million euro dollars transferred to companies in the Virgin Islands. Turkey, and actually in Chile, Turkey is another one of these right-wing regimes of Erdogan. But in Chile, where a couple of years ago there was 1 million people on the streets protesting about public servants, and now there was a candidate in the recent presidency supporting Pinochet and putting forward the old right-wing ideas that we thought had been defeated in Chile. Now, the right are using the vaccine issue and the COVID issue to gain a foothold in the working class. There were big demonstrations recently, just about a week ago, in Europe. There was 40,000 people turned out in Vienna, 35,000 in Brussels. There was a major riot in Rotterdam where 100 people were arrested. There were shots fired because there was a lot of violence. And these demonstrations in Austria, in Brussels, in Rotterdam, led by the right. There were also demonstrations on that same weekend in Italy, Switzerland, Netherlands, and Croatia. Now, in Austria, there's a 30-day lockdown, and there's also the proposal to have compulsory vaccination. So we need to be sympathetic to the argument that lockdowns are not helpful. They cost money, they cost jobs, they make extraordinary inconvenience, and also that the compulsory vaccination is a difficult issue to stand over. Now, it's important that workers protect themselves and make sure that disease is not arbitrarily spread into workplaces. Nonetheless, we can't say that everybody who is opposed to the measures in Austria is a right-wing winger or a fascist or an anti-democratic person. There are some genuine issues that need to be dealt with as well. So we can oppose the involvement by right-wing in these issues, trying to exploit them for their advantage, but also be sympathetic to, for example, pregnant people that women don't need or don't want sometimes to take the vaccination because of the threat that they perceive. There was also, it's not just these European countries. There was a big march in London in July, where we had a load of speakers in Trafalgar Square on the anti-masking issue. Jeremy Corbyn's brother was there, and we had the usual kind of conspiracy theories up on the platform. One person talking about lizards taking over the world. They also focused, of course, on other issues, principally the immigration. But aside from these groups which are actually in government, such as in Hungary and in Poland, there's also right-wing parties gaining a foothold in many countries. In Denmark, the People's Party. In the Netherlands, the PVV, which has seats in Parliament and was behind a lot of the protests and demonstrations in there. In the Netherlands, the Sweden Democrats, which had origins in neo-Nazi and fascist organizations, they're now in Parliament and play a significant role in the Swedish Parliament. They recently brought down the Prime Minister. She was the Social Democratic Prime Minister, was voted out of office. Well, she resigned because she lost support in the Parliament, principally because of the role that the Sweden Democrats played. In Britain, we have groups like the British National Party and the English Defence League, Toby Robinson, people. Now, they never got a foothold, never got an echo in England, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't take them seriously in future developments. In Germany, it's a very serious situation. The Alternative for Deutschland has now got a presence in all the in the main regions across Germany, and principally it's the eastern states of Germany where their base is. That's the poorer region, and that's where there's most alienation There was a group in Germany also, which you'll remember, called Pegida, that held demonstrations every weekend against immigrants in Germany. And of course, in Spain, there's the Vox Party, which is nostalgic for the days of Franco. In France, a serious threat is now before us, where the presidential election, which is to take place next year, could well see a runoff with one of these representatives. Now, there's of the right. There's competition between the new Front National, which is now called Rassemblement National, National Rally. There's competition between them and this a new guy called Lamour, who has a higher vote in the opinion polls than Le Pen. So there's two right-wing parties, but nonetheless, they're a real threat in the forthcoming presidential election. Now, as well as these right-wing groups, which I just mentioned, there's also actual openly fascist groups also, one of them being in Greece, Golden Dawn, which recently suffered quite a setback. They were involved in a murder. A lot of their leaders were tried and they've lost support. And I think at the moment they don't have any representatives in parliament, but they're still there. They're still a fascist threat. In Hungary, there's the fascist Jobbik. In Bulgaria, there's an openly fascist group. In Sweden, apart from the Sweden Democrats, who are not democratic, of course, at all, there's the Network Storm, the White Aryan Resistance, and what are called the National Democrats. And comrades will remember in Norway, this guy, Anders Breivik, who killed dozens of young people on a holiday camp because they were social democrat, because they were part of a social democratic family. Now, there's going to be a lot of comrades speaking in the discussion about the United States, but there's some general issues I just want to allude to on that. Well, the United States has lost its hegemonic role in the world in terms of being the only superpower. They're now being threatened by China in terms of the economic growth of China, also the military presence of China in areas which America previously considered as their bailiwick. They lost two recent wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And Trump has managed during his short term, it was a very short term, you need to bear in mind, Trump is not a perpetual part of American politics, but his short term in office, he managed to mobilize racists, white supremacists, conspiracists, anti-Semitic groups, all kinds of the right wing and detritus that exists in society around him. He mobilized them, gave them new encouragement, and they're still there. They're all there. And the threat he and the Republican Party now pose is using voter suppression, gerrymandering, and rigging of elections to make sure that Trump wins the next presidential election. So there's a massive right-wing movement mobilized by Trump, but not sufficient to be guaranteed victory. But that's something we need to combat. The anti-democratic fascist groups in the United States have never really made a breakthrough. Historically, I mean, the Ku Klux Klan in the early part of the last century had 3 million members, but it never made, in recent times, never anything near that. There's other reactionary movements, of course, in America. Comrades will know about the Proud Boys, the Aryan Nations, which is like a church, and organizes several thousand people. Inequality and divisions in the United States is what's behind the rise of the right. They can exploit these inequalities and exploit that alienation. And Trump says that everybody against him is a socialist. Anybody who opposes Trump is described as a socialist. But that's both positive and negative. It means that socialism gets a bit of an airing, even in the anti-Trump broad kind of movement. But nonetheless, what Trump represents is a very reactionary movement. I saw recently that 52% of the Republican Party have a positive view of Trump, which is what we refer to. I've noticed also that a majority of Trump's voters are talking, or at least support, secession of a group of states who have a majority of Republican voters. Now that brings us back to the days of Lincoln, 1861, assassination, Civil War, secession. No, it's not going to happen, but it still shows what the mood is amongst Trump supporters. And then, as Carol referred to just now, January the 6th this year, when Trump stimulated and gave rise to a mobilization of racists, white supremacists, fascists, conspiracists, when they marched on Congress. Now, it wasn't an attempted coup. There was never any question of them taking power. In fact, what the Congress was doing was simply just ratifying the vote for Biden. But nonetheless, it was aimed at intimidating and breaking down the resistance of Republican senators at that time. And of course, it's also aimed at society at large. But the rise of Trump coincided with the rise of other right-wing leaders as well, such as Bolsonaro and others on a global scale. Now, just because the extreme right are weak at the moment, as I'm talking largely about the fascist right, doesn't mean we can be complacent. When Hitler took power in Germany in January 1933, there had been 10 years of attacks on trade union headquarters, burning of premises, murder of people on the streets, attacks on Jews, on disabled people, on Roma, and other minorities. So just because a party is small, which Hitler's group was originally, doesn't mean you can be complacent about it. When the party was first formed by Anton Dexler, in 1919, Hitler just went to a meeting and became their principal speaker. And he was going around the place speaking, agitating, and then his gangs and the brown shirts. By the way, the brown shirts were called that because they got their uniforms as a surplus from the German army who had been attacking the Herero peoples in Namibia. And the stuff left over from their war against the Herero people in Namibia were given to the Nazis. That's where the brown uniforms came from. But nonetheless, they were attacking people on the streets. The paramilitary wing was very active. But the election of 1928 in Germany, the Reichstag elections, the Nazis got 0.8% of the vote. It's quite a small percent, obviously, 0.8. In September 1930, they got they got 0.8 million votes. In September 1930, they got 6.4 million votes. And in July 1932, they got 13.1 million, which is 37%. And shortly after that, because of the failure of the bourgeois and the capitalist class to work on any kind of better option to defeat the workers, swung their support behind Hitler. But the party went from 0.8 million votes to 13 million votes in the period of a couple of years. And in the run-up to 1928, the Nazi party in Germany began just called the Workers' Party, then became the German National Socialist Party. Nonetheless, they were very small originally and probably a joke in many people's minds, but Hitler took power. And look at the devastation that was caused in Germany as a consequence. Likewise in Italy, Mussolini's march on Rome in October 1922, that was a fraud, by the way. He had already been appointed Prime Minister by King Emmanuel III when he started marching on Rome. He was already appointed. The illusion is created that it was the march on Rome that intimidated, that caused them to take power. He was already appointed Prime Minister at that stage. But before that happened, the 30,000 black shirts under Mussolini were attacking trade unionists and workers because of the occupation of the factories and the demand for public ownership that was spreading right across that workers' movement. The British Union of Fascists never got a foothold either, in England. Mosley's group, because of the defeat that they suffered at the hands of the working class in the mobilization around Cable Street, and that was the end of Mosley. Although Mosley didn't accept that because he stood in an election in the 50s and got less than, it wasn't even, the vote was just a ridiculous, tiny percentage of the vote. He stood in Notting Hill using the Notting Hill riots at the time as a kind of angle. Just as an aside, there's nothing, all of this also affects Ireland. There was a movement among the leaders of the IRA in the 30s to form an alliance with the fascist leaders in Germany. And one of the leaders of the IRA at that time, who had met the fascists, had a statue in his honor set up in North Dublin. Somebody went out one night recently with a sledgehammer and knocked his head off. So they knocked the head off the statue, I should say. They knocked the head off the statue. And for a long time, the headless statue stood there in Fairview Park, which represented some kind of a recognition that this guy was a fascist, a sympathizer. But anyway, they put the head back on, and now there's a computer chip in the head, so they'll be able to trace it if somebody else decides to knock it off this time. It's worth also bearing in mind, by the way, that the Irish revolutionaries, or some of them, in 1916, including Patrick Pearse, who might be well known, approached the Prince Joachim in Germany and offered him the would he like to be King of Ireland in the event of a German victory. couple of things went wrong there. First of all, there wasn't a German victory, and secondly, Joachim died before the opportunity came up. Now, I just give that as an illustration that there's nothing special about Ireland or any other country when it comes to the rise of extreme nationalism, which can then, not inevitably, but it can then drift towards fascism. It's important to distinguish between different, Corellia, Kim, now in my time there, right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's important to bear in mind the different kinds of rule. The military police dictatorship, army coups, fascism. Now, there are particular reasons why the capitalist class would move to support fascism. They burnt their fingers badly in the 30s by supporting the fascists in Germany and Italy, so they won't make that mistake easily or readily again. It's the last resort. When the workers' movement is so strong that they can't defeat it by military rule, by coups, the dictatorships, and things of that nature, then they will turn towards fascism. It's also worth referring to the fact that there were major defeats of the working class in Germany that allowed fascism to emerge. It wasn't an arbitrary thing, just as if the people decide, oh, well, I'll vote for the fascists. That's not what happened. The working class were defeated in a series of revolutions from 1918 to 1923, and that defeat had an enormous effect on the morale of the workers. The occupations in Italy were defeated and broken up violently before Mussolini took power. So before the fascists can gain a foothold, lots of things happen initially. The capitalists, the landlords, the banks support fascism under certain conditions, but it's not their preferred option. It's worth also referring to theocracy, which we don't often include when we talk about the rise of the right. Like you have, there was a guy called Hassan al-Banna who founded the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. And the reason he founded the Brotherhood at that time was to combat the rise of left-wing and socialist ideas amongst the peoples of the Middle East. So the Muslim Brotherhood began as an anti-socialist, anti-left-wing movement, and they still have influence in many countries. They were influential in Egypt. That's why this guy was kicked out. I mean, al-Sisi is the present leader, but Morsi, who was elected, was overthrown because he was a representative of the Muslim Brotherhood, which of course the Saudi Arabians were not that happy about. So theocracy is also a problem in terms of the right. In India, theocracy is significant because of Hindu nationalism is quite significant in Indian politics. And it also represents the suppression of independent organization by workers. So theocracy is another problem we need to face. Part of the rise, the reason for the current rise of the right, is the inability of the traditional right-wing parties to get their base in society as Jews have before, like the French Gaullists, the British Tories, the Christian Democrats in Europe. They're all losing their foothold in society. In Britain, Johnson had to turn the Tory party into UKIP in order to increase the support for the party. So he absorbed the program of UKIP, and thereby the old traditional Tory party doesn't get the support it used to. The same is true, of course, in America, which John Ryman often refers to, where the traditional Republican Party, the conservative capitalist party, has been supplanted by a group of xenophobes and just people who represent a new right-wing trend in society. The Austrian Chancellor Kurz, who was the Conservative People's Party candidate, has recently been involved in forged invoices of taxpayers' money and things of that nature. So the disintegration of the old conservative parties is also some of the stuff that's behind the rise of the far-right groups. Principally, it's disillusionment with the left governments which gives rise to this. There's been a series of social democratic governments in Europe since the war. All the countries, all the major countries of Europe have all had social democratic governments. In some cases, many in succession. In the case of Britain, there were 11 Labour governments since the foundation of the party, 11. And look where we are now. Look at the vote. I mean, we should have had socialism 10 times over, or 11 times over in England. And disillusionment with that social democratic and Labour tradition leaves the way open then for the right, and the extreme right in particular, to come across as acceptable to some sections of workers. It happened in Brazil, where the failure of Lula da Silva and the Workers' Party in particular enabled Bolsonaro to be elected. Now, just in conclusion, I want to just point to some of the issues we need to deal with. The austerity program is going to increase. There's no question whatever about that. Whatever about temporary payments that governments make to ease the effect of COVID, at some stage, there's going to be massive cutbacks in terms of the social wage that goes to society, housing, unemployment, social services, public spending, and that's an opportunity for the right to gain a foothold, a stronger foothold. There needs to be, we need to combat that right-wing trend, which is going to be a way of analysing, a way of dealing with the cutbacks that are going to come in the wake of the COVID pandemic. We should look at Brexit, just in passing, as an example of how the right-wing seized on that as a way of dealing with the austerity program that was being carried out, attributing all the blame to European Union, calling for independence and take back control and stuff of that nature. But basically, that's the way they combated that's the way they explained the hardship the workers were going through. It's worth noting also, by the way, that Margaret Thatcher was a great supporter of the single European market. She thought it was a great thing that Britain could export freely into the European market. And yet, one of the main demands of Johnson and them was the destructive nature of the single market. Plus all these liars, I mean, they're just a bunch of liars. That were lies told by Johnson. He said it'd be 350 million a week on the NHS. Farage published a poster of a load of Syrian refugees entering Turkey. He said they were on their way to Britain. And they used all these lies and propaganda as a way of deflecting the workers and trying to capture kind of vote from disillusioned workers who were suffering from austerity. But like I mentioned earlier, there have been defeats for the right. It's not all a negative picture. There have been defeats in Greece, even in France, in regional elections recently. Le Pen and Macron both suffered. They couldn't capture any of the regional parliaments, whereas the left did. The left did make some gains. In Germany, there's now been a replacement of the Christian Democratic Party with a government led by the Social Democrats. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to resolve the problems, but the program that they put across for the election was affordable housing, child allowances, stabilized pensions, and renewable energy. So that's the kind of program that can be used to defeat the right. In terms of ourselves, we have to advance a program, houses for all, to undermine the idea that it's most important that houses go to the native population. A living wage, which is enforceable across countries. We have to fight for that. That then helps us to defeat this notion that all these foreign workers are coming in, working for lower wages. That's Johnson's argument, and undermining the conditions of English workers. If we insist on a transnational minimum wage, we can deal with that. By the way, there's 54 million members of trade unions in Europe, 54 million. And they should all be involved in various ways through the local organizations and the national organizations in discussing questions of that nature. The trade unions also need to publish papers in many languages. It's not sufficient to just do the old way, do the old things the old way. It's time to publish newspapers in many languages where the populations who don't speak English can be integrated and involved in the trade union structure. One of our unions here, SIPTU, the big general union, does publish a paper in Polish. I think that needs to be done more broadly. We need to organize workplace meetings to discuss this issue of racism and division and to undermine the hold that the right might gain. And we need education programs amongst trade unionists and worker activists to understand the issues as they arise and how to combat them. This is not a time for defeatism. This is a time for confidence. The workers need to rise up. The trade union and labor movement needs to rise up and to break the hold of the far right. There's no room for compromise on these issues. Every concession we make encourages and helps the right. The only way to deal with these issues of the rise of the right, whether it's in government in Poland or right-wing parties on the fringe or fascist parties as they emerge in various countries, the only way to deal with it is to mobilize. Socialist policies and class organization are essential for a defeat of the forces of the right and the forces of reaction. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Finn. That was fantastic. I really learned a huge amount from you this afternoon. I just want to add a little aside when you talked about the British Union of Fascists and the defeat at Cable Street in the 1930s, which obviously isn't very far away from where I live. But during the late 60s and the early 70s, even though it was a time of quite a lot of prosperity in many ways for ordinary working people, I used to go down to near Cable Street and along Brick Lane with my dad on a Sunday. I was terribly bored by it, but I went along with him. And there used to be fascists there selling their newspaper. Even at that time, they'd be selling, they would be ex-soldiers generally. They would have medals on, they would be wearing their medals, and they'd be selling a newspaper. And they called themselves the Ex-Servicemen's League. And my dad would get into arguments with them, and I have very strong memories of him fighting in the street with them, literally fighting in the street with them. He was quite a big bloke, so invariably he won, and I would be a bystander watching them. And his attitude was, remember what Trotsky said, fascists, you acquaint their heads with the pavement. And he literally carried that out. So, you know, he fought the fascists, literally. And because he was a big bloke who'd been a bit of a boxer, he knew how to handle himself, and he did. So sorry for that little aside, but I felt I had to say it. So I'm going to open up the meeting for people, and I can see I've got 2 names up with their hands up already. What I would say is that it is different. If you want to speak, it is different on different machines. So for some of you, it'll be put your hand up in participants, and for others, it may be in reactions. But if you put your hand up, and then I will bring you in. So the first name I have is Steve Zeltzer, followed by George Shaw. So Steve, hello, and over to you, comrade.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you for having the this meeting. I wanted to say that I think that we have to look at the rise of fascism in the context of decline of U.S. imperialism and the need to increase profits. One of the things we know is that the reason of the export of capital to China was the need for new markets for capitalism. And that was a reason for China's ability actually to develop its economy with massive capital investment from around the world. What is happening today is the decline of the U.S. imperialist empire and the rise of economic threats like China and other countries. And this leads to adventurism by U.S. imperialism, and also is a sign of the inter-imperialist rivalry that's going on globally. That leads to war, world war. And I think that we have to put the rise of fascism in that context. We are going towards world war. And the United States now is talking about small military confrontations with China. We may have to have small military confrontations. So the question is, in the rise of fascism and the rise of the right in the United States and internationally is organized, fascists are organizing internationally, and the working class social democracy is unable to confront fascism. And that's, I think, critical. The role of, there is no social democracy in the United States, with both the Democrats and Republicans are pro-capitalist parties, and and the union bureaucracy in the United States do not want to educate and organize workers around the fight against fascism. So for us, it means building a united front of the working class against fascism, both in the United States and internationally. And that can only be done by revolutionary forces. The Social Democrats, the trade union bureaucracy is hostile in the United States to educating workers about the rise of fascism. In fact, when the Vermont AFL-CIO called for a general strike if there was an attempted coup in Vermont, Richard Trumka said that it was out of order and they censured them and investigated them for saying there should be a working class action, general strike working class action against the threat of a military coup. That is still on the agenda. There is a possibility that Trump could come back in the United States. And that means a successful right-wing reactionary force taking power in the United States. What does that mean internationally? It means right-wing forces all over the world would be strengthened. We're talking about a struggle for power of the working class, and the working class is unprepared politically. One of the things is the fascists are organizing using the pandemic, which is very important. These anti-vaxxers in the United States and internationally are not only putting out their propaganda, but also they're attacking unions. They attacked the Italian unions. They were involved in attacking the Australian unions, the trade union organizations. So the rise of fascism is serious. And I think that that the task of revolutionaries, the task of the working class is to organize itself politically. In the United States, there is no labor party. There is no mass working class party, and that is critical in the defense against fascism. That should be one of the points of a labor party, to fight fascism, racism, and xenophobia. But we're talking about going into revolutionary conditions and on a global level. And that fight requires that we have a perspective towards uniting the world working class against these fascist forces, and also challenging the trade union bureaucracy, social democracy, which is incapable of confronting fascism, because it would mean the politicalization and organization of the working class independently, which they are ideologically opposed to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. You've raised some very interesting points there. So I'm going to bring in George, and then I'll bring in Maddie after George, and then I'm going to go back to you, Finn, to see if there's any points that you want to make in response. So George Shaw, would you like to come in?
Thank you. The current thrust is mainly against Islam. I'm referring mainly to Europe, because this was really started at the time of when Charlie Hebdo was bombed in Paris. Now, Charlie Hebdo was ostensibly a left-wing magazine, but in fact had displayed front pages denigrating Islam repeatedly prior to the attacks. This has not been publicized much. Regarding Morsi may have been a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I do agree with you that Hassan Banna represented the founder of modern the Muslim Brotherhood, and also Kubda. They represented the most reactionary side of the movement in Egypt. But in fact, Morsi was quite radical in his very short reign for a year in Egypt, with quite a number of reforms, and in my view, infinitely far more better than the previous Mubarak and the current President Sisi. Now, moving on, the other two movements that you haven't mentioned was in Central Europe, there is the white replacement theory. And this is the main proponent of that is the son of Albert Camus. And also another grouping called the Identitarians, also originated in France. And in America, the nearest equivalent would be Spencer and Bannon. Those two represent the sort of intellectual theories behind the white replacement theory. Iran is a theocratic republic, theocratic Islamic republic, and it's not fascist. The royal family, Edward VIII and Wallis, his wife, the Duchess of Windsor, they were very pro-fascist. The other thing I want to mention is the fact that the white replacement theory and the identitarians are getting increasingly prominent, and they have not been mentioned very much. And they are not, in appearance, obviously fascist. They sort of represent the kind of intellectual side of fascist ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. And I'm going to go now to Maddie.
Yes, Finbar, thank you for mentioning Sweden, because this is where I'm living at the moment and where it looks like I might be stuck for the foreseeable future. You mentioned the Swedish Democrats, the extreme right-wing party. There's actually quite a long history of fascism in Sweden. You remember that Hitler got it into his head to measure craniums to prove that there were certain people who were of a lower status, lower race. The idea came from a research institute in Uppsala, which was started in the early 1900s. The King of Sweden at the time, the old king, was actually quite pro Hitler, and rather like Edward. I don't know that he actually went down to see them, but Goering, who would spend his summers in Sweden, he was married to a Swede, I think, was friendly with the king and with a lot of top politicians. If Sweden hadn't been neutral, there was a good chance of them actually coming in on the Nazi side. And they made sure there was no real opposition to whatever they were doing, like letting Nazi trains travel through Sweden on their way to Germany by locking up all the communists. But if we come to more recent times, roughly the time that we had Tony Blair in the UK, Sweden had a social democratic government who followed him. And since then, we've had switches from social democracy to more conservative, to social democracy and conservative again. Between them, they have privatized large sections of basic public schooling. They've privatized very large sections of the whole medical, national health type of medicine. I cannot go to find a doctor who isn't working in a variety of areas, except for my eyes, but all the other specialists are in private practice. Luckily, the private health, national health insurance covers it. So it's not sort of runaway escalatory prices in the US. But the fact that they have sold out this, they've sold out municipal care of the elderly. Of course, private companies want to make a profit. And the result is that there has been an extreme decline, particularly in care of the elderly. Our COVID patients were over 60%, probably 70 to 80% of the people who died as a result of COVID in Sweden were in care homes, where the staff simply couldn't cope. They didn't have the facilities. And so the rise of the Swedish Democrats is extremely concerning. And as you pointed out, we have other very pretty right-wing parties as well, the Christian Democrats. And people in Sweden who are trying to fight against this point out that both the leader of the Christian Democrats has lost a case in court for harassment of someone. The Swedish Democrats have a number of their leaders have been up in cases from sexual assault to embezzlement. And yet, what do both of these parties claim? That they are against criminality. Personally, I find it extremely worrying that there is this huge rise in right-wing sentiment in Sweden. And as you correctly pointed out, the Swedish Democrats have got a foot in the door now. They're not only in parliament, the budget that they are stand behind is the default budget for the country now. The Social Democrats' own budget didn't get enough votes, and by default, then the opposition's budget gets in. In Sweden, it's called the brown-blue coalition, blue being conservatives. So the situation here, I think, is very grave. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. Finn, would you like to come in at this point and just make a few comments?
Yeah, I welcome all the contributions that have been made so far. They're all contributing, helping us to get a deeper understanding of what's happening. And we should spend some time also at this meeting discussing that crucial question that was raised by Steve earlier on about the United Front. It's essential that a United Front is built to fight fascism on a local, a national, and an international scale. I mentioned some policies that might be developed in that regard, but we need to spend time looking at that and comrades explaining what their own experiences have been in that regard. Maddie is correct in her analysis of the situation with the Sweden Democrats. There is a dodgy history there. Norway was invaded. There was always a strongish kind of, in the pre-war, kind of sympathy for Nazi ideas in Sweden. It's not the dominant thing today. In fact, it's worth mentioning that our supporters, our Win supporters in Sweden, are fighting against Sweden Democrats and are very successful in some regards in keeping them at bay, but it is a threat. They did vote against the budget, and the consequences, the collapse of the SD coalition, that's quite right. Stieg Larsson has written quite a lot about the situation of fascism in Sweden, and I'd recommend comrades to seek him out and try to read some of his essays and some of his work on that. There's a issue that George raised about white replacement. Now, obviously, I can't deal with everything, but that's a correct issue. The white Christian civilization, for example, that's the term that's used in Hungary by the right wing there. to create hostility to Muslims. There's a group in France called Génération Identitaire, which is the identity issues that George is referring to. And they're linked or have some sympathy for the Australian who killed 51 people in New Zealand a couple of years ago. They also have some kind of a base. Now, they're not the immediate threat, but they do have some kind of a base in France, and it's right that we consider them. And like I say, in the discussion, it's important for comers to point out ideas that we might not be sufficiently familiar with, and to use this discussion to help us to get a fuller grasp. The issue about Morsi, which George raised, I must say I don't agree with. I wouldn't compare Morsi's regime as being better than, say, al-Sisi's or Mubarak in that sense. It's the movement that's worth looking at there. There was a mass movement, demonstrations and mobilizations that overthrew Mubarak. And he was replaced enthusiastically by Morsi, no question. Mass support for the downfall of Mubarak, and Morsi became the new leader. He then began to change the constitution and the approach to questions in Egypt to try and transform the state into a Muslim a state that's driven and inspired by Islamic ideas and such things as Sharia law. Now, you can't support that, even if there might be some social advances. The overall agenda is the restoration of rule and turning Egypt into a theocracy. Of course, it's probably true to say that el-Sisi is worse than Mubarak in terms of the repression. That's true. But the way to combat that, I think, is not to compare one leader with another, because there's a sad history in Egypt of that, but to see what policies we can put forward to fight them all. Mubarak, Morsi, and al-Sisi. There's another important question that Steve raised about the absence of the Labour Party in the United States. Again, we need to hear more discussion about how that might come about, but that's absolutely correct. There is no social democracy. By the way, it's also worth mentioning that social democracy was a revolutionary philosophy. I mean, Lenin, Luxembourg, Liebknecht, they were all social democrats. The Social Democratic Party in Russia split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, but they were still social democrats. Of course, that all changed after World War II, when the deal was done by Kreuzky in Austria, Brandt in Germany, people like that, Palme in Sweden, to take away the revolutionary aspect of social democracy and turn it into instead a managerial way of dealing with the capitalist system. But nonetheless, I mean, there isn't even that in the United States. So any kind of Labour Party or Social Democratic Party would be in advance in America, and we need to have a look at it. Need to look at how it might be done. Look at in some detail at that. And finally, it's absolutely correct. If Trump wins the next election, that's a huge shot in the arm for the right wing across the globe. Just like when Trump was elected the last time, that coincided with the rise of the right in several countries. In fact, in the Australian riots recently, there were riots just a few days ago in Australia, in Sydney, in Melbourne, in Brisbane, and they were carrying banners of Trump and some of these marches. So the victory for Trump would be a victory for the right across the globe, and it's correct to point that out. So when we're fighting against the re-election of Trump, it's not just an American issue, it's a global issue that affects us all. So I thank the comrades for their contributions, and it's important that anybody who has information or stuff that might help us to understand more fully general issues we're discussing would be very welcome. And I'd like a particular examination of the United Front. How might it be built on a local, national, and international scale to fight against fascism on a world scale?
That's great, Finn. Thank you very much. So I'm going to take another three. So that's Carol Lang, David Hempson, and then Matt. Okay, so Carol Lang, you're up next, Carol.
Well, there's a lot of things, but one of the things that Steve and I are attempting to do in the United States is to build this United Front for a Labor Party, because the bureaucrats have gotten the working class completely by the throat, attached to the Democratic Party. Basically, in my union, I'm in the teachers union, we were just, got an email saying, why don't we increase the amount of money that we donate to something called COPE, which is basically a way to donate to, it doesn't say donate to the Democrats, but it gets funneled into the Democratic Party. There's never a discussion on any other possible alternative. The AFL-CIO, which is the parent union, gets this year alone got $75 million from the American government and has been tied to the American government lock, stock, and barrel for its entire history from, you know, the beginning when Gompers, I don't know if anybody knows the history, but Gompers, who organized the AFL, really did it in opposition to the Wobblies and has been apolitical. And then when it's been political, it's only been political based on let's support the two-party system. In terms of, I didn't know that about Sweden, and in terms of the racism and the craniums, but when Hitler sent his, this is how deeply racist the United States is. When Hitler sent his emissaries to look at projects that were sterilization projects in the United States in the 1920s, organized by the Rockefellers, and Hitler's people came to the United States, he said, oh my God, American race laws are worse than even what we have in Nazi Germany. So historically, and going back already after the Civil War, the white establishment has attempted to pit Black and white people against each other because white people were poor, and white people, a lot of them in the South, supported the North in its, you know, bid to keep the South from seceding. But there's really nothing new under the sun. I mean, fascism, the capitalist class has got nothing. It's really got nothing new except to ultimately resort to fascism. And that means building these, you know, movements in the streets. That there's Spencer and some of the other people who organized the demonstration in Charlottesville in 2017, where some guy took his car and plowed into demonstrators. They're now in court because the people who were hurt by the guy who rammed the car into the demonstrators, they're trying to get their money to try to shut them down, because the bourgeoisie and wealthy donors, who we don't actually know all of them, are contributing to allowing them to organize these demonstrations in different parts of the United States. I don't know if anybody has seen this video, but there's a news feed called Vice, which you can find on YouTube. And if you look at the 2017 Charlottesville demonstrations by the right, one of the fascists that was interviewed, it was gleefully smiling, saying that we essentially take our, not orders, but we take our inspiration from the Golden Dawn. So this is definitely an international movement, right? And we are hamstrung by the bureaucrats in the United States who want us only to vote for the Democrats and do nothing else. And even there was a trial, I don't know if anybody is following this, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where this white 17-year-old racist fascist kid killed two anti-racists, and he got off. He got off. The judge clearly and brazenly sided with the fascists against, you know, against the families of the victims. In fact, people who were saying that these people are victims of this guy, the judge explicitly said, you're not allowed to use that term. You can call them rioters if you want, if they're rioting, but you can't say victims. And I mean, if that wasn't bad enough, Biden, who's supposed to be the representative of the Democrats, did not step in. And ultimately, at the end of the day, Biden said, well, the jury system works. I mean, it was like so mind-boggling, and we are left so profoundly defenseless, and people don't know anything about fascism in the United States. They don't understand what this means. They have no way of protecting themselves. Mostly the people who were in charge of these these demonstrations that are anti-fascist or pacifists. I mean, I was like really taken by the discussion about Cable Street and how your father, beat the crap out of the fascists. That's the only thing that we can do. We have to beat the crap out of these people, because they're going to believe that, and they would be right, that they, in fact, after the Kenosha hearing, fascists got on all these public, domains and said, isn't this a wonderful verdict? Now it's literally open season on anti-fascists and anti-racists. And I think that as the economic crisis gets worse, as it deepens, as Biden starts talking more about war with China, the economic crisis, the United States spends over $700 billion a year on weapons. So that the GDP is in the direction of war, not in the direction of housing and healthcare or any of those other things. And I mean, I think it's clear that a showdown is going to happen. And I mean, there's no way of predicting when, but it could be like within the next 10 years. And given the fact that the environment is completely crumbling, there's going to be a lot more refugees moving around to try to find some place to live. And that's going to incite the fascists even more. So I agree. I mean, we really have to organize an international united front against the fascists. I'm not sure how to do that, especially since the unions will never get on board. But I have every expectation that as the crisis deepens, more and more people will be out on the streets. And we have to be perfectly honest about the fact that the Democratic Party or any of those other social democratic parties in Europe are going to be able to rise to the occasion, that it's going to have to be a workers' revolution. And I don't think we should make any bones about that or hide that. I mean, that is really the only solution. Okay, so that's it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carol. And it's really interesting to hear from comrades who are actually in America. And we're going to hear from another one now. David Hempson, your turn.
Okay, thanks, comrades. Look, I think it's a really marvelous discussion, which is touching on very many issues. So, we're ranging far broader than we're all going to be able to make a neat summary at the end. So, Finn, you've got a difficult job. But could I start with the idea, first of all, that society is going through permanent change. I mean, that's the idea of Marxism. There's churn in capitalism. Capitalism is a dynamic system, but it's a system in decay. And in decay, all kinds of terrifying, horrible, disgusting movements, raise their head. Some I'll touch on, which, are really important in terms of the structure of power in capitalist society. And I'll explain as we go. So I want to deal with that side, and I'm going to give a kind of one-sided situation, because I'm not going to do a kind of balanced situation in terms of one point, the right and the left. And I believe that we have the power to change society and that we will change society. But I do think we need to look facts in the face. When I was in Portugal in 1976, after the Portuguese Revolution, everywhere I raised a fist, there were fists raised in solidarity. But everywhere there were posters of aborted children, blood, horrible figures. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And what was happening, and I want to develop this a little further, is that when there's revolution, there's counter-revolution. And the Catholic Church was totally associated with fascism and dictatorship in Portugal, what did it do to defend itself? It started an anti-abortion campaign, showing the dead fetuses of children from their mothers and denouncing the idea that there should be abortion and women should not have rights over their body. That's how reaction and fascism fights back when there's revolution. And that can divide society, because society at its base, among working people, there will be different views on abortion. There will be some who are traditionally view this and do not necessarily support a freedom to be able to undertake, for women to be able to undertake that. And so we will see divisions, arising, which the fascists, try and use. And I just want to make one point just quickly, and I won't develop it too far, but Finn, I'm not sure that capitalism is in favor at every point in terms of bourgeois democracy. In fact, in the colonial world, there's very few democratic states at all. South Africa is something of an exception, and we've got the most terrible different movements, which are counter-revolutionary movements, xenophobia, slaughter of foreigners at various times in the recent past, and very unstable conditions. This is very far from a bourgeois democracy in South Africa, and that's the most advanced, quote unquote, democratic country in Africa. And many of the African countries, when Trump was in power, supported Trump. 2/3 of the population in Nigeria supported Trump and thought he was the answer. Museveni and Uganda, many leaders, despite the fact that he had utter contempt for African people and was a racist, these regimes gave support. And this is the problem that we face, and this is where we have to fight. And then we have this dislocation of consciousness. We have a working class majority throughout the world and in America, and yet we have vast movements, well, I wouldn't say vast movement, but very polarizing movements of anti-abortion movements, anti-scientific movements in America, which go back to, well, into the 20s and 30s and even beyond, where it was previously illegal in America to explain evolution. It was banned in the South to be able to explain science in schools. And that had to be fought and fought and fought. And that legacy is still with us in all kinds of backlash. There's backwardness, extreme backwardness in most bourgeois societies. Scientific ideas are not allowed to circulate freely, or they're dampened down, or they're ridiculed, or they're made into conspiracy theories. I just want to mention a horrifying fact that in Tennessee, people who are dying of COVID are attacking the doctors and the nurses, even while they're dying. It's bizarre. In other words, every time they're told you're dying of COVID, they say you're telling a lie, and they're even attempting to hit them. And they feel that the entire society, a modern bourgeois society with the provision of doctors and nurses, is a conspiracy against themselves. This is Trump's base. These people are dying literally. They have a higher death rate than the Democrats. The political persuasion that they have indicates their life expectancy. It's bizarre, and it's a dislocation, and it shows the extreme decay of bourgeois society and of capitalism. The problem we have is that some of these movements are quite popular at the moment, and we see it in the 6th of January uprising. Something like more than half the Republicans supported that. Now, Finn, you're right to say it wasn't a coup in terms of being able to overthrow the entire society or the states in America. That was bizarre, but they tried to overthrow democracy. That's the point. The people were going to ratify the electoral results, and they wanted to burn those results, get rid of them, and to beat up or even to kill the Republicans who were going to vote for Biden to take power. They are anti-democratic. Now, where are we in terms of a range of views which are anti-democratic. We have these populist movements, and then we have fascism. Fascism is, in a sense, for them, an ideal type. That's the glory they could attain. If they can have victory after victory, like Mussolini's march, as they march to the right, and as they mobilize, they get more and more power, then they become more and more extreme in their view, and then they can start being honest about where they really want to take society. They are not in favor of, of women's rights at all. In America now, we have a situation where it is entirely likely, it's absolutely fantastic, that women may lose the right to abortion in America. This is a modern society that, in a sense, that would be more aggressive than in Europe and elsewhere. And that is achieved through mobilizing the Catholic Church. And I have to say that the Catholic Church is the most reactionary institution in America and internationally. Now, I come from the Protestant background, and boy, it's pretty reactionary too. But listen to this. Hundreds of thousands of people have been sexually abused in this place, in the church, and yet they loyally support it, or still feel they have to support it. The abuse that bourgeois society allows of young boys and girls is absolutely fantastic. And these reactionary movements rely on the church, on established traditional society in its extreme, and on their denial that they are sexually abusing people. They rely on that denial. And then they try and build up a defense of existing bourgeois right-wing institutions. And this is where we have to find. And then we find that Marxists in America are voting for the Democrats. In other words, Marxists who know exactly about the character of the Democratic Party, but we have a situation now where the bourgeois parties, we have two bourgeois parties, and now we have a bourgeois party which is actually it's trending towards fascism. It's trending. I don't say it's there. It's not there, but it's populist. It's there to divide and destroy social solidarity at the base, and to turn American society into atomized bits and pieces. Rugged individualism, the idea that the individual will rise as a heroic figure out of society, like Nietzsche, a kind of fascist big man. Every little man can become a big man. It's always men, it's never women, and rise above society and force their will on society and deny science, deny COVID, deny that there's racism in America, deny democracy, and fight against democracy actively. It's not just a passive thing. They are totally hostile to the ideas of democracy. They only want to use democratic norms to be able to get power. And this is the problem we face. Then we face what we see, this problem, this question of the United Front. I'll just try to close on this point. At the moment, it seems there's a kind of paralysis. The Democrats are losing the popular base. They've been unable to carry out reforms, which they said they would, through their own internal divisions, not the limits of capitalist society, through their political divisions, that they have not carried out these reforms, which mean that working class people are not seeing the benefits yet in their hands, and so they're vulnerable to right-wing trends. And that's what we see. And this paralysis is very peculiar. We find that although women are threatened with the right of abortion to be removed, there's very little mobilization. It reminds me of South Africa at times in the 1960s, where there wasn't resistance, to fascism as rising after the banning of the ANC and so forth. People were transfixed by the rise of the right. It seemed like they were all powerful. In fact, there were pipsqueaks. They were absolutely useless, but no one, when I would be mobilizing to get people out in the streets, I would get hundreds. I wouldn't get thousands. And yet we had the base, we had the social base to resist fascism as it arose in South Africa. And yet there was weak links all over the place. And the liberals were the weakest people possible to come into a united front. So we have to return to the base. We've got to look to the mobilization of working women against the rise which is patriarchal violence in America is rising. It's rising in America. By the way, just one odd little fact. I only learned this today. That guy who killed, who mowed down 6 people in Wisconsin, he'd been committing domestic violence against women time and time again, and yet the judges had let him loose. And then he went and killed six people on the streets. Unbelievable, because of the tolerance of men's violence against women, which is a fascist phenomenon. It's part of a reactionary movement. Then we see that they're allowed to be loose and they can carry on at will. This leads to the demoralization of society. I would like to develop much more what we could do in response, but I hope others will come in. I've only dealt with one side, and I'm vulnerable to accusations of that. I take that one. I just want to develop that side and to listen to other comrades coming in. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm going to bring in Matt next, and then Finn, I'll give you the floor if you want to say anything before I go on to the next group of speakers. So Matt, the floor.
Hi, comrades. Yeah, thanks for that. I know, very interesting discussion. I think there's a few things, certainly observations. I think I don't agree with, I think it was one of the comrades said that the insurrection on January the 6th was not serious. And clearly it was. It was an armed attempt. And they were armed. They had actually entered in, and there was the conspiracy extended into the state. And they entered the capital, and with guns. And Trump's supporters made sure that there was no intervention from the state forces for several hours. There is no question that's very serious, and they could have. There's no question they could have killed, at the very least, could have killed a whole series of leading politicians in the US. It's only a matter of luck. They didn't. And the fact that they were more or less incompetent and hadn't done these things before. But there's no question that was very serious in terms of the structure of the state and the whole state of the US in general. And as comrades said, about the decline of the US, it's a facet of it that such a thing would occur. I think that the other thing that comrades also say, talking about bourgeois democracy, bourgeois democracy is not a natural thing for the bourgeoisie. It had to be extracted from them. They weren't going to concede, democratic structures. They in fact only conceded democratic structures, certainly, fully in the wake of the Russian Revolution, under conditions in which they were extremely frightened, and rightly so. The full franchise in Britain was only conceded in 1918, or well, almost full. Obviously, not complete to women until 1928. So these things, it's not a natural thing, and it's quite clearly contradictory. It's a concession they've had to make, and it causes them problems, and it's something that has to something that has to be used by revolutionaries in a very careful way. But it's a concession. No question that bourgeois democracy is a concession to the working class. I think the other thing in terms of fascist movements, the fascist movements are, of course, street movements. And based on this mobilisation in the street, and the question is really how does the left attempt to prevent that? And attempt to obstruct it and prevent, it's a battle, for the street. It's also, of course, as the other thing, of course, as comrades have started to outline, is the whole question of revealing. I was pointing out some detail by subsequent to the Nazis. Of course, is the link between the fascists and elements of the bourgeoisie. There's no question. You look at the US. There are elements of the bourgeoisie who openly fund the far right and the militias and so on and so forth. And the question is obviously to expose this and point this out. But of course, these things are not, some kind of populist operation, thought up by ordinary people somewhere. They're actually funded and organised and so on and so forth in the interests of a section of the bourgeoisie. I mean, obviously, fascism is also, of course, a very dangerous phenomenon for the capitalist class itself. It's deeply unstable. I mean, it is, as Trotsky says, the last card. They don't play it lightly. You know, they obviously have it now in preparation because they can see that things are getting much worse, and the problems that they have, you know, both economically and socially are getting to a real severe point. So, and the thing is also, you know, you look at fascism today, and it's very different. I mean, obviously, you've now got a position, you know, I mean, far from, say, you know, the Nazis, where the Nazis built the SA as the street movement, and then, of course, liquidated its leadership as soon as they'd finished with it in 1934. Now you have fascist organizations which have been around for decades. You know, for instance, I'll take a couple of examples. I mean, there are actually areas in working class areas in Turkey which have been dominated by fascists for 30, 40 years. And the same actually in the largest slum in Mumbai, which has been dominated by the Shiv Sena, one of the Indian fascist movements for a number of decades. You know, these things actually have existed as political formations, and as I say, control you know, working class areas, and I think it would be worth actually trying to, you know, study how these things work. In terms of, I mean, what's actually happening, you know, in terms of the position you've got now, into, you know, where you can see what you've got is this horrible sort of political vacuum that, I mean, you know, I mean, you see it here, where in fact, of course, the capitalist class has deliberately destroyed the large part of the organisations of the working class, much of it, you know, and I mean, okay, you have trade unions and so on and so forth, but at a much lower level, and with a great deal less activity and a great deal less following within the working class, and of course, I mean, the trade problem obviously, as we can see, I mean, trade unions have no particular credibility even among their own members for obvious reasons. You know, and the same goes for political organisations. You know, I mean, we can see obviously the collapse of social democracy. We can see as you say, the contortions of the Tory party and so on. You can see also, you know, this whole question of the creation of populist movements. I mean, the interesting thing about UKIP, of course, is it, you know, if you take a parallel between UKIP and the fascist movements of the 70s in Britain. Of course, the first fascist movements in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s were largely built actually out of the Irish community in many cases. You know, it's second and third generation immigrants themselves. UKIP, of course, successfully co-opted a whole lot of immigrants of all sorts. So, well, you know, you're here, but you should stop everybody else getting here, you know, all this sort of stuff. It's very odd the way they did it. But what you can see now, I mean, in terms of, you know, here where I live in Glasgow, what you've got basically is this huge political vacuum throughout much of the place because there's no organisation. That really leaves the whole thing open, you know, for the likes of these people, of course, who will, you know, have the funds and the ability and you know, can summon up these sort of populist campaigns, and that's really dangerous. And okay, there's been, you know, in terms of, you know, there's effort and a valiant effort by the left. I mean, certainly here to deny all of these organisations the street. We've always done this for decades. We've refused to allow them to move anywhere, to march anywhere, or to show themselves. You know. But I don't know for how much longer. The thing is, the core thing, of course, has been in this city, of course, is that there's a separation of the Orange movement from the fascist movement, which is deliberate. I mean, it's deliberate. The Orange movement, of course, is got links to the state and has refused to cooperate with the fascists. But what we're now starting to see is the younger elements of the Orange movement beginning to break towards the fascists, which is a really dangerous phenomenon. It's incredibly dangerous phenomenon. The fact that the thing itself, you know, the whole Orange thing itself is actually breaking down in that direction, and that could be really that's really very dangerous. And again, the whole question of the organisation of the left, and can we maintain this policy of refusing to allow these people the access to the street, which is critical, absolutely critical in terms of preventing this thing from operating. So I think that in those terms, it's then okay. How does the left both put forward its own positive view to the working class and actually show a way forward in terms of the real crisis, and at the same time, being absolutely four square against any operation by these fascists. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. Finn?
Just make a couple of brief comments. I want to thank the comrades, first of all, for clarifying some of the issues. I agree completely, of course, with Matt that the attack of January 6th was an extremely serious event, which is a threat to Democrats and the working class on a global scale. I agree with that fully. And people could have died, and far more could have happened. And the idea was to kill people on that occasion. But the point I was making was that it wasn't an attempted coup, because by presenting it in that way, that would create demoralization and a sense of a huge task before the working class. It wasn't an attempted coup. It wasn't an attempt to seize state power, or if it was guaranteed to fail. The rich democratic traditions of America and the traditions of working class struggle wouldn't have allowed that event to be. A coup wouldn't have happened as easily as that. But it was an extremely serious event, and Matt is right to emphasize the seriousness of what happened January 6th. Likewise, when David pointed out about bourgeois democracy, I agree again with the point you're making, David. Bourgeois democracy is a form of capitalist class rule. That's all it is. It's not an abstract kind of way of dealing with issues. It's a way in which the capitalist class rule. It's not always the way they rule, like I tried to point out in my opening contribution. They can rule in many ways, by military, police dictatorships, by Bonapartism, by fascism, by theocracy. And bourgeois democracy is only one form of class rule. And where it doesn't suit them, they won't bring it in. And there are many countries where support regimes which are nowhere near bourgeois democracy, such as Saudi Arabia, such as many other countries in the world. So when it suits them, they'll support others. The point I'm making is that in a bourgeois democracy, they create the illusion amongst workers that by voting every 4 or 5 years, somehow they can affect a change. And if that doesn't work, they get rid of it. But when I say it's the preferred forum, it's the easiest forum in which they can rule without the difficulties and the lack of control other regimes might pose. And also, I agree completely with the Catholic Church. And you're right to point it out. There are many examples. I mean, Pius XII made an agreement with the Nazi regime in the 30s that they wouldn't interfere. He made an agreement with Mussolini that if they kept away from Vatican City, he'd keep away from the Italian fascists. More recently in Argentina, when the Pope visited Argentina, he publicly chastised a left-wing priest who was involved in some social movements against the Argentinian regime, which the Catholic Church supported. In terms of Franco, the Catholic Church supported the Franco regime fully. Opus Dei played a huge role in the Spanish Civil War behind Franco. And the Falange Party, an openly fascist party, was supported by many people in the church. So the Catholic Church has a huge amount to answer for. And just in terms of Ireland, the state in Ireland after independence gave over to the Catholic Church the education system, the health system. Many of the social care homes were given over to the Catholic Church to run. And as a consequence, there was the horrific brutality which is now being revealed. The most recent case being where babies were taken from their mothers and sold to families in America, where the mothers having any say whatsoever, without even knowing where the children were going. And there's a big inquiry into that. So you're right to point these things out. So I thank the comrades for all these clarifications that were provided. And I hope I didn't confuse anybody in my opening contribution by trying to cover so many issues. So when comrades clarify, it's right that they would do so in a meeting such as this. This is not a polemical discussion. This is a way in which you're trying to fill out our understanding of the issues that have been raised in the discussion. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, Finn. And you're right, it is a huge topic and it's bringing in so many different things. And I think that this idea of united front is absolutely vital to this conversation today. So I hope that someone else, perhaps who hasn't had their hand up yet, would like to come back in on that part of the debate. So what I'm going to do now is go to the next lot of speakers. There's 3 people who've got their hands up, and I'm going to take them in this order. That's Joe, Duffy, Roger Silverman, and then Themos. And we may then just about have time for one more person after that. Okay, so Joe, over to you. We can't hear you, Joe. I think you're muted.
I've just unmuted myself. Can you actually see me there?
Yeah, we can see you and we can hear you.
Okay, I can't see myself, and maybe that's a good thing. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to make a number of disparate points. There's not exactly going to be a thread of connection between them, but I think they're points that need to be considered. Okay. One is, I note a huge concern, a sense of what I would call acute realism amongst the appraisals that different comrades are making in relation to the threat that's ahead. And particularly, there's questions posed implicitly in relation to our ability to fight back on this, because this is an international movement that's really taking off. In the past, this would have been completely dismissed as unrealistic and wildly pessimistic, that such an international movement would grow. And I don't need to recap on the presentations of previous comrades in this. But I would give an example from the 1980s and 1990s in the CWI. There was complete dismissal of any chance of serious right-wing reaction of fascism ever really appearing. And it was based on the so-called Marxist analysis. And it was a Marxist analysis, and we all went along with it, and I probably believed it as well, which is that you have to look at it in terms of class, and that because of the huge increase in the world working class, in the numbers of workers throughout the world, and at the same time a decline in the middle classes and in those sections of society which were the backbone and which financed and were the backbone of the membership and of the fascist movements in Italy and Spain and Germany, that therefore on the basis of class forces there would not be a reappearance or a re-emergence of widely popular right-wing movements. Now I know we don't get into semantics in relation to right-wing movements and fascist movements. They're quasi-fascist. They're leaning in that direction. As somebody says, the youth in the orange movements are moving towards fascism. There's an awful lot for us to be concerned about, and we have to be very careful about being schematic about what is the situation, what needs to be done, what's not on, and what is on. And I would just take a couple of quotes there from previous speakers. One, an American speaker said, "Unions will never be on board." Another one which says, "A majority of protesters on the anti-fascist demonstrations are pacifist." So when you take sentences like that, and then you look at the movements against fascism in the 1930s and in Germany, France, and Italy, where the workers' movements were extremely strong, extremely well organized. They were the backbone of the anti-fascist resistance. There was a consensus, and I know about the split between the communists and the socialists, so I haven't really got time to go into that, but by and large, there was an established and a radical trade union movement there. There was a radical socialist and communist movement present in those countries. They had far more going for them in relation to troops, in relation to being organized to be able to resist the fascists. We can make theoretical points, we can make points which need to be made. I'm not dismissing them on the basis of being theoretical, but they are theoretical in the sense that we are calling for organizations to combat fascism, and we should be doing that. And it's not about anything other than combating fascism on the basis of all the evidence and for all the reasons comrades have said. But again, going back to the realism, looking at the evidence and looking at the experience of comrades who've been requesting help from trade unions and from other workers' organizations in relation to organizing against fascism, the policy is one of appeasement, not combating. They will far sooner back initiatives which are nice and woolly, nice and kind of soft. It's all about moving people very gradually. They do not want a worker based analysis, they don't want a class analysis based understanding of fascism. They haven't got that themselves. They're not going to finance the perpetration of those ideas. So when we're talking about the creation of a united front, and we're looking at all the organizations of workers and different organizations, we have to take into account that will be the first place we'll be encountering resistance will be the leadership of a lot of these organizations will be looking to make up the united front, in that an awful lot of them are very, very well cushioned, very, very middle class people who've come through the system, ended up in nice, comfortable positions, and they're not going to be organizing fights against fascism on a revolutionary front. Okay, so it comes down to the left then, and maybe the far left, to make these calls and to kind of try and inject these ideas into the movement, and we would all see that is our role in that. Just going back to fascism again. It's an extremely fertile ground for right-wing ideas to grow. That's why they're growing. You've had the collapse of the Soviet Union and the apparent ideas of communism. You have the collapse of the social democratic movement, their absolute betrayal of the interests of the majority of people. You have them being portrayed as absolute hypocrites in countries like France and so on, because they stood by austerity and so on. So with the collapse of left and the communist, the social democratic and the communist movements, fascism is not selling itself as fascism. It's selling itself as radical, as people's parties, as the nationalist parties. We'll stand up for the country and so on, and that's why they're growing. The agenda for them in the next period, I don't think we're going to defeat their arguments on the basis of going into history with people. It's going to come around to things like very concrete issues about influx of refugees, and with the climate movement and so on, with the climate emergency and the breakdown in states in Africa and many, many countries, there's no prospects whatsoever for people. The number of refugees is bound to increase. That's where the battleground will be fought. That's where the battles of ideas will be fought in relation to left versus right. There's other issues I could mention as well. David Hempson, I think, was spot on in relation to a lot of things he said, and particularly one of the so irrational. The one thing about fascism is that there's so many irrational things, but we have to work out why they're irrational. I'm sure we've no problem in doing that. But to people who are anti-vax, despite all the science, they're going to be anti-climate movement measures as well. They'll end up attacking some of what they see as the middle class green protest movements and so on. There's going to be not a fusion, but a crystallization maybe of a working class identity around defending workers' living standards in our communities on the basis of protecting ourselves against these costly eco measures, against supporting refugees, and in the context of the destruction of services. Okay, I'm not making the link. They make the link. Okay, totally incorrectly, of course. But this is the politics that they thrive on. And then, if there is conflict between the far left and fascist movements in relation to protests and that, they will really welcome that. I think they will actually. The situations being inflamed works in their favor, and then it allows those who are soft, the appeasers, to come in as the voices of reason, and that further bolsters their position. It also has the effect of isolating the far left, who might be attacking fascists, and there's measures taken to isolate and further marginalize the far left. This thing is very, very complicated. I could go on, but I'll try and stop there and say that really, I've had a look at the perspectives in the 80s and 90s, and we were categorical about things. We cannot be categorical about anything. We have to look at the dynamic situation in each area, in each country, in relation to what is the agenda for the fascists. Why is the ground so fertile for them? The established left has failed. We are in a very weak and vulnerable position. So we have to go about our work very patiently, very carefully, and maybe we're running out of time. It's a very difficult situation, is the main point I want to make. But I'll lead into this. The discussion now on a united front, I could say I'm in favour of a united front, and I'm in favour of, I could list organisations that I think would be involved in that, but I'm going to leave that to other speakers, okay, because I've spoken enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Now I've got 3 hands up and we are running out of time. So I'm going to be quite strict about this. I'm going to give you 5 minutes each, Roger, Themos, Ed, and then I'm going to hand back to Finn. So over to you, Roger.
Okay, thanks, comrade. There's so many points that have arisen. I'll try just to confine myself to a few because of the time. It's really been a very, very productive discussion. Just one thing I'd like to say, just in passing before I get to my main point. When we talk about bourgeois democracy, that's not a question of liberality or kindness on the part of the bourgeoisie towards the rest of the population or towards the working class. Bourgeois democracy means democracy for the bourgeoisie. It's a way that the bourgeoisie, a form of government that the bourgeoisie adopted in order to prevent one faction of the bourgeoisie gaining an unfair advantage or gaining control in place of the bourgeoisie as a whole. And of course, it's only in rare instances that bourgeois democracy in any form has been actually achievable by the bourgeoisie because of the enormous complications of maintaining rule in society with all the conflicting pressures. The rise of authoritarian, reactionary, racist, populist parties around the world has understandably created and struck alarm. The Greek figure Varoufakis, for instance, said just after the 2008 crash, he said, "From where I stand, we're at a 1930 point soon after the crash with the fascist movement upon us." 2 or 3 years ago, a book was published in Britain under the title Creeping Fascism, which was exposing the worldwide triumph of what the author called a new manifestation of fascism around the world. One more person I'd like to quote, the economist Harry Schott, who was a remarkably penetrating observer. He wrote in the 80s and the 90s a series of books in which he predicted with astonishing foresight the likely consequences of the impending economic catastrophe. One of the tiny handful who actually predicted the financial collapse that came in 2008. In the early 90s, he predicted, it's something I've quoted before, but I think we should always keep this one in mind, a financial holocaust on such a scale as to bring comprehensive ruin. And he said such a disaster could undo all the considerable gains so painfully made by Western civilization in the 5 centuries since the Renaissance and usher in a new dark age. So what we have to consider is, are we descending into a new dark age? And all the old spectres, of course, have returned to haunt us. Things which, as Joe said, in the 70s and 80s were still dismissed as alarmism and defeatism. But one of the factors in the new situation is that the previously dominant section or faction of the ruling class is increasingly finding itself displaced by a new breed, a sort of monstrous bastard offspring, horribly deformed and parasitic, represented by such specimens as Trump and Johnson. And you could say that just as the industrial bourgeoisie became superseded in turn by finance, capital, and the banks, now in this most degenerate and decadent phase of capitalism, it's the most vulgar parasitic elements in the bourgeoisie, the hedge fund managers, the property speculators, the money launderers that are clawing their way to power. And a perfect specimen of this is Trump, the crooked property tycoon. The only faction that really prospers from this swerve is those who crave the complete scrapping of all regulation, the black money brigade sheltering in their offshore islands, tax havens, inspired by the world's most notorious black money launderer, himself in hock to the Russian mafia and to Putin, and that's Donald Trump. And this faction is preparing the way for collapse and even civil war in the USA. But the point about when we say that the 6th of January events did not represent an immediate threat is because the bourgeois state quite manifestly did not support the coup. And why is that? Because they knew how unstable that would make the situation. They knew that that would not be the end of a process. It would be the beginning of a completely new era in American history. The question has not yet been put to an ultimate test of how stable these regimes that have been quoted are around the world. Again, I like quoting W.B. Yeats when he said that things fall apart, the center cannot hold. That's quite a fitting description of the social and political fragmentation that we see around us today. There are strict limits to the power of all these aspiring dictators. Let's remember that every one of these monsters, Trump, Salvini, both of them are gone for the moment, but Trump, Johnson, Salvini, Orban, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Modi, Duterte, and all the rest, and even at a stretch, including Putin, came to power within a nominally democratic parliamentary framework. And their positions are,
you've got 30 seconds.
And their positions are insecure and unstable. Now, what I just want to say is elections are a notoriously unreliable indication of the true balance of forces in society. Look at India. In May 2019, Narendra Modi won a landslide majority. Since then, we've seen one after another of the biggest general strikes in world history, involving 250 million workers, and also this huge uprising, almost unprecedented uprising of the peasants, who occupied the capital for months on end and have won a stunning victory and a retreat. There is a lot more that I would have liked to say, and well, I wish that I had the opportunity, but I better leave it.
Thank you, Roger. Femos.
Yes. Carell, can I just say that I'm bringing my hand down, which gives other speakers a little bit more time.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Themos, and then that will give time for Finn to say what. Thank you, Ed, for that. Over to you, Themos.
Well, I have been reluctant to speak mainly because I agree with most of what has been said, and what I disagree with is not really an important disagreement. Nevertheless, I feel that we have to revisit the question of the class basis of fascism. And as has been correctly said, capitalism is today a system in decay. But we have to push our analysis a bit further, I think. 2008 ushered in a new era in this capitalist decay. And it's been highly exacerbated by COVID-19. And obviously, capitalism is changing, and it's changing radically. The super monopolies are really the main rulers of the economy today, and not only of the economy, but also of the politics internationally. And fascism has always thrived on the disenfranchised middle class. And in this situation, it is the majority of capitalists who are being threatened by it, but they are losing the control over society. And this is the sort of thing that we have to see. And that's why I think we see also with these people, many working class forces going over into this far-right xenophobic movements. And this working class support for the far right is very dangerous. And it's dangerous because the far right is taking over some of the things that we should be doing. I mean, when I say we, I mean the left in general. The anti-vaccination, for example, going into the anti-vaccination camp, it's not because they don't like the vaccines, most of these people. They feel the oppression that they are living under, the lockdowns, under the autocratic measures that are being taken. And since the left is not taking up the fight against the government on this front, they find, the far right finds a handle to take up this fight and giving all these preposterous conspiracy theories and all these crazy ideas. And the way to fight the far right, it's for the left to give to take up the correct opposition to the capitalists, to the correct opposition to the government, the correct opposition to the autocracy that is being pushed. And we have seen this happening. I mean, if we take the Golden Dawn, it was thriving because they were fighting these sort of things. When Syriza took up the fight, when they got into government, the wind was the momentum of the Golden Dawn was taken out, and most of the right-wing people gravitated towards the conservative right. And now, and that's why the conservative right had the opportunity to appropriate most of the policies of the Golden Dawn, leaving out the extreme elements, the really extreme elements, and put them in jail. But of course, the defeat of Syriza and the capitulation that happened is creating a new situation where we could see these fascists growing again. It's not an immediate threat because, as I said, most of its policies have gone to the mainstream right, and they are taking up keeping out the immigrants and all those sorts of things. And we can see this also in America. When we see Trump, maybe he put all these sort of policies, but who supported him? I mean, the people who supported him, a large chunk of his supporters were working class. And we should be very clear about it. We should see that if we don't take up the fight, they will.
Thank you, Themos. And you were our last speaker. And I'm sorry if I had to cut people short, but I am very mindful of the time. Finn, I'm going to pass back to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Carol. I'll be very brief. First of all, I want to thank all the comrades who made contributions. And it's been a very useful and very constructive discussion. We're all fighting against the rise of the far right. Everybody here in various ways is fighting against the rise of the right, whether in anti-racist campaigns, right the way through the fascist groups and fascism itself. We need to recognize that. And what this discussion does is it fills out the broader experience we all need to look at and examine to make our own struggles a bit more successful. Roger made a very important point there in his last contribution, that we also have our victories. It's not all defeats. Like Bolsonaro is very unlikely to win the next election in Brazil. It's more likely Lula da Silva will succeed in that. Orban is also in Hungary in a less secure position than he was. Now, he won 4 successive elections, but he may well not last in Hungary. And there have also been gains in France and in Italy and other places where on the surface it looks like everything is going downhill. It's not. There are also some victories and more stuff to be achieved. Joe is quite right to point out the seriousness of the fascist threat. But it's what is to be done is the question. Matt says that the way to get the other comrades also to defeat the fascists is to take them on physically. Just intimidate them, get them off the streets, as happened in Cable Street, and it's happened still. Whenever the fascists mobilize, we mobilize counter demonstrations. That's the fascists. But in terms of ideas, we have to combat the ideas of racism, the ideas of extreme nationalism, and the ideas that divide the working class. That doesn't mean that the workers we're arguing with are fascists. When we go to a union branch, you'd hear ideas that have these kind of characteristics being expressed. So we have to argue and bring forward facts and figures and serious rational reasons as to why we need to have a left-wing program to unite workers and to break the hold that right-wing people have over sections of the working class. So the fascists, yes, confront them on the streets, break their morale, intimidate them, and discourage them from mobilizing. The program of education has to be brought into every single organization of workers, community groups, trade union groups, various NGO type groups. Wherever the ideas are being discussed, we need to raise the alternative ideas. And just finally, our own experience in terms of United Front. This group I mentioned, Lekela, which is the Irish anti-right-wing, anti-fascist group. It was set up by a group of trade unionists like ourselves in the Trades Council, plus other groups. And at present, it consists of some trade union involvement, the Irish Women's Council, which is a national body of women, anti-racist groups, groups that are supportive of asylum seekers and refugees. They're all along involved with us. They speak at our meetings, they speak at our rallies. And we try to draw in the trade union movement nationally. Now, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, at its recent annual conference in Belfast, which I attended, had a fringe meeting. They organised a fringe meeting in order to discuss this question of the rise of the far right, and they invited some speakers. It was a half online, half presence type of organisation, a meeting. But the meeting was held to discuss what to do about the far right. And we need to draw the trade union movement more fully into that particular struggle. So once again, thanks to all the comrades for their contributions. It's been a very helpful and very constructive discussion. And we need to go away and consider all the questions that have been raised and make our own interventions that be more fulfilling and that be more successful as a consequence of discussions of this nature. So thanks again, comrades.
And a huge thank you to you, Finn. That was an absolutely amazing lead off. I think we've all learned a lot from you and from each other, but a huge thank you to you for a very fascinating and informative 2 hours. Before we go, Roger, do you want to just say something about next week very briefly?
Yeah, all right. Next week is going to be our last meeting of the year. We're going to have a slightly extended Christmas holiday. And what we're doing is, like we did last year in the end of 2020, is we want to have an informal discussion about a kind of review of the year and of where we're going. So all comrades, I hope you'll come prepared with some ideas about that. There won't be any formal lead off. So we really welcome everybody's observations and opinions on the way things are going. Thanks.
Thank you, Roger. Great to see everybody and hope to see you all again next Sunday.